Hello, beautiful soul. Before we begin, take a slow breath and settle into your energy, because this reading carries a message that may explain something you have been feeling for a while, but could never completely put into words. There is something about the past that keeps resurfacing in their mind. Not everything that happened between you, not every conversation, not every memory. There is one particular moment that keeps pulling them back, one conversation, one exchange, one moment when they had the opportunity to tell you the truth, but instead they chose silence. And what is interesting is that they may have convinced themselves at the time that it was better this way. They may have thought they were avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. They may have believed they were protecting themselves. They may even have told themselves that there would be another opportunity later. But now, when they look back, they realize that moment carried much more weight than they understood at the time. And this is where your reading begins. Because what they remember most is not necessarily what you said. It is what they could not bring themselves to say. There was something sitting behind their words, something beneath their behavior, something they were feeling but refusing to reveal. And now, that hidden truth has become louder than the words they actually spoke. So if you have recently felt as though this person is thinking about you, remembering you, or mentally returning to an unfinished situation, this reading may resonate deeply. Take what feels meaningful to you and gently leave behind anything that does not, because this is not about forcing an outcome. This is about understanding the emotional pattern, the unfinished conversation, and the truth that may have been buried beneath someone's silence. And I want you to listen carefully to this part. You may have wondered whether you imagined the strange feeling you had during that final conversation. You may have wondered why something felt different, why their words did not completely match their behavior, why you walked away feeling that there was more beneath the surface. You may have thought, perhaps I am overthinking this. Perhaps they meant exactly what they said. Perhaps there was nothing else there. But the energy around this situation suggests that the story was not as simple as the words made it appear. Something was being held back, and you sensed it. Maybe you did not consciously know what it was. Maybe you could not have explained it. But you noticed a hesitation, a change in their tone, a pause that lasted slightly longer than it should have, a look in their eyes, a strange distance, a sentence that felt incomplete. Perhaps you asked something and received an answer that technically made sense, but emotionally did not satisfy you. That kind of moment can stay with someone, and it can stay with both people. But here is the difference. You may have eventually tried to move forward. They may have tried to do the same. Yet while you were attempting to understand what happened, they were attempting to avoid understanding it. And avoidance can work for a while. It can work for a day, a week, a month, sometimes even much longer. But eventually the mind returns to whatever the heart never properly resolved. And that is what I feel happening here. They are revisiting that moment. They are looking at it from a completely different perspective now. At the time they were inside the situation. Now they are outside of it. And distance has given them clarity. They can see things they could not see before. They can recognize the ways they protected themselves. They can recognize the things they were afraid to admit. They can recognize how their behavior may have affected you. And perhaps the most difficult realization of all is this. They may understand that you were giving them an opportunity to be honest. And they did not take it. They chose the safer answer, the easier answer, the answer that allowed them to leave the conversation without exposing too much. But safety and honesty are not always the same thing. Sometimes protecting yourself creates another kind of pain. Because when you hide the truth to avoid losing control, you can end up losing the very connection you were trying to protect. That may be one of the biggest lessons surrounding this person. They wanted to remain in control of the situation. They did not want you to know how deeply something affected them. They did not want to reveal how much they cared. They did not want to admit that they were uncertain. They did not want to show vulnerability. And perhaps they did not even fully understand their own feelings. So instead of saying, I am scared, they became distant. Instead of saying, I care more than I want to admit, they acted indifferent. Instead of saying, I do not know what to do with these feelings, they may have tried to make the situation seem simple. And instead of having the difficult conversation, they allowed the conversation to end. But ending a conversation does not always end what was happening emotionally. That is why this moment keeps coming back. Because somewhere inside them, they know there was another version of that conversation, a version where they were honest, a version where they told you what was really happening, a version where they admitted what they were feeling, a version where they stopped trying to look unaffected. And their mind keeps wondering what would have happened if they had chosen that version. This is where regret can begin, not necessarily dramatic regret, not necessarily the kind that someone openly announces. Sometimes regret is quiet. It appears when they are alone. It appears late at night. It appears when a familiar song comes on. It appears when they visit a familiar place. It appears when something reminds them of your personality. It appears when they meet someone new and notice that the connection does not feel the same. It appears when they realize that moving forward has not erased the memory. And sometimes it appears in the form of a simple question. Why did I do that? Why did I say that? Why did I stay quiet? Why did I make things harder? Why did I pretend I did not care? Those questions can become incredibly uncomfortable because there is no one else to blame. At some point, they have to look at their own decisions, and I feel that this person has been doing exactly that. They are beginning to understand that the distance between you was not created by one single event. It was created by a series of choices, small choices, little moments of avoidance. Unspoken feelings, delayed conversations, pride, fear, uncertainty, and each individual moment may have seemed insignificant, but together they created distance. And now they may be realizing that they contributed to the very situation they were afraid of. They may have been afraid that becoming vulnerable would make them lose you. Yet by refusing to become vulnerable, they may have pushed you away. That realization can hurt, because now they cannot simply say things happened naturally. They may know that some things happened because they were unwilling to communicate clearly. And I want you to understand something important. If you felt confused by this person, that confusion may not have been because you were incapable of understanding them. It may have been because they were not being consistent. There is a difference. When someone's internal world is chaotic, their external behavior can become contradictory. They can come close and then retreat. They can show interest and then act distant. They can seem emotionally present one day and unreachable the next. They can make you feel important and then suddenly make you question whether you mattered at all. That inconsistency can be emotionally exhausting, and perhaps you spent far too much time trying to decode it. You may have asked yourself what you did wrong. You may have wondered whether you were too much, too emotional, too available, too distant, too honest, too caring. You may have searched for the mistake inside yourself. But this reading is asking you to consider another possibility. Maybe the confusion was never created by you. Maybe the confusion came from someone who was struggling to be honest with themselves. And when a person does not know how to communicate their internal conflict, the person on the receiving end often feels the consequences. That may have been you. You were trying to understand the message. They were trying to hide the message. You were trying to read between the lines. They were trying to make sure there were no lines to read. And that creates a strange emotional dynamic. But now something is changing. The person who once avoided the deeper truth may be getting tired of avoiding it, and this is important. People do not always change because someone pressures them. Sometimes they change because their own behavior becomes impossible to ignore. Eventually, the consequences of avoidance become louder than the fear of honesty. That is where I feel this person is moving. They are beginning to understand that silence did not make the feelings disappear. Distance did not erase the memories. Pretending did not change the truth. And perhaps trying to move on did not give them the peace they expected. There may even have been moments when they thought they were completely over it. They may have convinced themselves that enough time had passed. They may have told themselves that you had probably moved on. They may have tried to focus on other things. But then something happens. A memory returns, and suddenly they are back in that conversation again. They remember where you were sitting. They remember what you were wearing. They remember the atmosphere. They remember the expression on your face. They remember the exact moment they almost said something, and that almost becomes the painful part. Because almost is one of the most difficult words when it comes to relationships. Almost told you, almost admitted it, almost reached out, almost stayed, almost chose differently, almost said the truth. And now they may be realizing that an entire chapter of their life was shaped by those almost moments. There is also something else here. They may remember the way you looked at them, not because you were necessarily trying to communicate something consciously, but because they felt seen. And being seen can be uncomfortable for someone who is hiding. You may have looked at them and, without saying anything, made them feel as though you could tell there was more. That can make a guarded person retreat even further. Because if someone is already struggling with vulnerability, feeling emotionally exposed can make them defensive. So perhaps they changed the subject. Perhaps they made a joke. Perhaps they acted casual. Perhaps they became colder. Perhaps they ended the conversation sooner than necessary. Whatever the exact behavior was, the underlying pattern is the same. They were trying to regain control, and now they may regret doing that because they can see that you were not demanding perfection. You were simply asking, directly or indirectly, for authenticity. You wanted to know what was real. You wanted to know where you stood. And they did not give you the clarity you deserved. That is one of the strongest messages coming through. Clarity, not fantasy, not chasing, not forcing, clarity. And perhaps the reason this situation still feels emotionally alive is because clarity was never fully given. A relationship can end. A conversation can end. Contact can stop. But unanswered questions have their own kind of life. They continue inside the mind. And this person has questions. They may be asking themselves whether you understood more than they realized. They may wonder whether you knew they were hiding something. They may wonder whether you walked away because you felt the inconsistency. They may wonder whether you lost trust because of their behavior. And they may wonder whether it is too late to correct it. That final question is significant. Is it too late? They may not know. And uncertainty about your response could be one of the reasons they have not acted yet. Because approaching you would require more than simply saying hello. It would require them to acknowledge the past. It would require them to explain themselves. It would require them to admit that they were not completely honest. And that is much harder than sending a casual message. A casual message allows someone to test the waters. A deeper conversation requires accountability. And I feel they are caught somewhere between the two. Part of them wants to reach out. Another part says, what if they reject me? What if they no longer care? What if they ask questions I cannot answer? What if they remember how I behaved? What if I have lost the right to come back? These thoughts can create hesitation. So if there has been silence, do not automatically interpret silence as absence of thought. Sometimes silence is a sign that someone does not know how to approach what they are feeling. That does not mean you should wait for them. That does not mean you should stop living your life. And it certainly does not mean you should chase someone for answers. It simply means that emotionally, the situation may not be as finished for them as their outward behavior suggests. There is a difference between someone not contacting you and someone not thinking about you. Those are two completely different things. And this person may be thinking far more than they are expressing. They may even have imaginary conversations with you. They may rehearse what they would say. They may imagine how you would respond. They may think about sending a message and then delete it. They may look at your profile or wonder what you are doing. They may ask mutual connections about you. Or they may simply carry the memory quietly. Again, take only what resonates. The deeper message is that there is unfinished emotional processing. And unfinished processing eventually asks for resolution. Now, there is another layer here that I do not want to ignore. This person may have been protecting more than their feelings. They may have been protecting an identity. Maybe they wanted to appear strong. Maybe they wanted to appear independent. Maybe they did not want you to know how deeply they were affected. Maybe they have always struggled with showing emotion. Maybe they were raised to believe that vulnerability equals weakness. Maybe they have learned to keep difficult feelings hidden. So when something real came along, their usual coping mechanism took over. Distance, silence, control, avoidance. But you may have brought something out of them that their usual defenses could not completely contain. That is why this connection may have felt different to them. You did not simply become another person in their life. You may have challenged the emotional walls they had spent years building. And when someone encounters that kind of connection, there are usually two possibilities. They can open the door, or they can run from it. They ran. At least emotionally. But running does not always mean the door disappears. Sometimes it means the person keeps looking back at it. And that is what I feel happening now. They are looking back. They are reconsidering. They are questioning old decisions. They are recognizing patterns. And perhaps most importantly, they are beginning to understand themselves. This is not necessarily a message about someone suddenly becoming perfect. People do not transform overnight. If they return, their actions will matter more than their words. If they apologize, watch whether the apology is accompanied by accountability. If they explain themselves, listen to whether they are genuinely taking responsibility or simply trying to reopen the door without addressing the past. If they return with consistency, that tells you something. If they return with the same confusion, that tells you something too. Your role is not to rescue them from their emotional discomfort. Your role is to protect your peace. You do not need to chase clarity from someone who refuses to provide it. You do not need to convince someone to recognize your value. You do not need to prove that the connection mattered, and you certainly do not need to put your life on pause while another person figures themselves out. The energy of this reading is not asking you to wait. It is asking you to recognize. Recognize that your intuition may have been responding to inconsistency. Recognize that their silence may have contained more than words. Recognize that their inability to communicate was not necessarily a reflection of your worth. And recognize that sometimes people understand your value more clearly after distance gives them the opportunity to experience your absence. When someone has constant access to you, they can become accustomed to your presence. They may not realize how much emotional space you occupy. But when that presence disappears, the empty space becomes noticeable. That may be what has happened here. They may have assumed you would always be there. They may have assumed there would always be another conversation, another chance, another opportunity. But life does not guarantee second chances, and realizing that can create urgency. That may be why this person is thinking about the past more intensely now. They may be wondering whether they missed their opportunity. They may be asking themselves whether they waited too long. They may wonder if you still have feelings. They may wonder if you would even listen. And perhaps they have already imagined you moving forward without them. That image can be difficult for them, because it forces them to confront a reality they may have avoided. You are not standing still. Your life continues. Your energy continues. Your world continues. And while they are replaying old conversations, you are becoming a different version of yourself. That is powerful, because the person they remember may not be the person you are today. You may have developed stronger boundaries. You may have learned not to accept mixed signals. You may have stopped chasing explanations. You may have learned to value consistency over chemistry. You may have realized that love without communication becomes exhausting, and that growth changes the dynamic completely. If they return, they may encounter someone who is no longer willing to accept the same behavior, and that is where accountability becomes necessary. They cannot simply return to the old version of the connection. They would have to meet the new version of you, the version who knows what they deserve, the version who can listen without immediately surrendering their boundaries, the version who can care without chasing, the version who can forgive without forgetting the lesson. And I believe that is part of why the energy feels so intense. There is unfinished emotion on one side, but there is growth on the other, and these two things are moving toward a point of truth. Maybe that truth comes through a message, maybe through a conversation, maybe through an unexpected meeting, maybe through an apology, maybe through a realization that changes how they approach you. The exact form is not the most important part. The important part is that the old pattern cannot continue forever without eventually being confronted. If this person has been avoiding honesty, life has a way of creating situations where honesty becomes unavoidable. And when that happens, they will have a choice again. They can repeat the old behavior, or they can finally tell the truth. This time, they may understand the cost of silence. They may remember what happened the last time they held back. They may remember losing closeness. They may remember your withdrawal. They may remember the uncertainty. And that memory could motivate them to communicate differently. But again, let their actions prove it. Do not build an entire future around a possibility. Allow reality to show you what is real. Now, there is one more message I want to bring through. You may have been asking, why did they not just tell me? Why did they not say what they felt? Why did they make everything so complicated? And the answer may be simpler than you think. Because telling the truth would have changed the situation. Once something is spoken, it cannot easily be taken back. If they admitted their feelings, they would have to deal with your response. If they admitted fear, they would have to acknowledge vulnerability. If they admitted attachment, they could no longer pretend they were unaffected. If they admitted regret, they would have to take responsibility. Words create consequences, and this person may have been afraid of those consequences, so they chose ambiguity. But ambiguity has consequences too, sometimes worse ones, because when you say nothing, the other person fills the silence with their own interpretation. They may assume you do not care. They may assume you rejected them. They may assume you have moved on. They may assume the connection meant nothing. And eventually, both people can walk away believing something completely different from what the other person actually felt. That may be one of the greatest tragedies of this connection. Two people experiencing something real but communicating it incorrectly. Two people protecting themselves at the same time. Two people waiting for the other person to make the first move. Two people afraid of rejection. Two people pretending to be stronger than they actually felt. And eventually, silence becomes the language of the relationship. But silence is not always closure. Sometimes silence is simply two people who did not know how to speak. That does not mean you have to reopen the door. It means you can understand what happened without blaming yourself. And that understanding can be freeing, because perhaps you have spent too much time asking what was wrong with you. Maybe nothing was wrong with you. Maybe you were simply asking for something that this person was not emotionally prepared to give. Honesty, consistency, vulnerability, clarity. And wanting those things does not make you demanding. It makes you human. So if you are currently in a period of no contact, uncertainty, or emotional distance, let this reading remind you of something. Do not chase someone simply because they are thinking about you. Do not abandon your boundaries because they may regret their choices. Do not mistake nostalgia for readiness. And do not confuse someone's realization with transformation. Real transformation is demonstrated. It is consistent. It is visible. It survives discomfort. So if this person comes forward, observe, listen. Notice whether their behavior matches what they say. Notice whether they are willing to discuss the difficult parts. Notice whether they can acknowledge your experience without becoming defensive. Notice whether they understand why you became distant. Notice whether they are willing to rebuild trust slowly. That is far more meaningful than a dramatic declaration. And if they do not come forward, that does not erase the meaning of what happened. Sometimes a person can regret something deeply and still lack the courage to repair it. Sometimes people carry lessons without returning to the person who taught them. Sometimes your role in someone's life is to awaken something they needed to understand about themselves, and then your paths continue separately. That possibility should not frighten you, because your life is not dependent on their realization. Your healing is not dependent on their apology. Your worth is not dependent on whether they come back. You are allowed to move forward while they are still processing the past. You are allowed to become happy without receiving an explanation. You are allowed to stop waiting for someone to say the words they should have said. And ironically, when you release the need for an outcome, your energy becomes much stronger. You stop asking, when will they return? And you start asking, what kind of relationship do I actually want? You stop asking, do they miss me? And you start asking, do their actions make me feel safe? You stop asking, will they choose me? And you start asking, do I choose this version of them? That is the shift. That is where your power returns. And I feel that this situation is moving toward a moment of truth, but your job is not to force that moment. Let it unfold. If communication comes, receive it with discernment. If an apology comes, decide whether it is meaningful. If they explain themselves, listen without abandoning yourself. And if nothing happens, keep walking. Because your life is much bigger than one unfinished conversation. Now, for some of you, there is another layer. This person may be experiencing a strange realization that the people or situations they once considered distractions are no longer satisfying them. They may have tried to replace the emotional connection. They may have tried to stay busy. They may have tried to convince themselves that another person could provide the same feeling. But comparisons have a way of revealing what someone has been avoiding. They may have realized that what they experienced with you was not easily reproduced. Again, this does not automatically mean they are ready for a relationship. It simply means the connection left an impression. And impressions remain. A person can move cities, change jobs, meet new people, start new routines, but emotional memories can travel with them. That may be why you continue to appear in their thoughts unexpectedly. And perhaps they are surprised by it themselves. They may think, why am I still thinking about this? Why does this memory still affect me? Why do I still remember what they said? Why do I still wonder what would have happened? Because unresolved emotion does not always follow logic. The mind can say, move on. The heart can say, but there is still something unfinished. And when those two voices conflict, people often become restless. That restlessness may be what you are sensing. Not necessarily as a supernatural certainty, but as the emotional residue of something that was never fully resolved. And if this reading has been resonating, I want you to pause here and acknowledge your own experience. Think back to that conversation, not to obsess over it, not to reopen old wounds. Simply observe it. What did you feel? What did you notice? What did you wish they had said? What did you know without having proof? And most importantly, what did you learn about yourself? Maybe you learned that you cannot live comfortably with mixed signals. Maybe you learned that you need direct communication. Maybe you learned that you deserve someone who can meet you emotionally. Maybe you learned that your intuition notices more than you give yourself credit for. Maybe you learned that love cannot survive on potential alone. Whatever the lesson is, take it with you. because the purpose of understanding the past is not to remain trapped inside it. It is to stop repeating it. And perhaps that is the true transformation happening here. Not simply them realizing what they lost, you realizing what you will no longer accept. That is much more powerful. So, beautiful soul, if you have been wondering whether that final conversation mattered, the message coming through is yes, it mattered. But perhaps not for the reason you initially thought. It mattered because it revealed something. It revealed the gap between words and feelings. It revealed their fear of vulnerability. It revealed your sensitivity to inconsistency. It revealed how much remained unspoken. And now, with time and distance, both of you may be seeing that moment differently. They may see their missed opportunity. You may see your strength. They may remember what they did not say. You may remember what you learned. And perhaps that is why this chapter still carries energy. Because it was not simply an ending. It was a lesson, a turning point, a mirror. And sometimes the person who refuses to tell you the truth teaches you how important truth is to you.